Okie dokie. Welcome to Distant Dad. It's the week of the Democratic National Convention in the United States in Chicago. It's lively protests today. Uh, Not sure anyone's been arrested, but there have been lively protests, parades, variety of other things. So anyway, the David Graeber book on debt, 5,000 years of it. I've sort of had a different thought about it. I think I don't have any problem reading it. I just think it's a little, I guess it's less analytic, but then again, I've been reading things that are not so analytic, and it kind of reads like Brad DeLong's book. So I'm trying to think if we might spend more time on other matters, but that's just me, and I'll make a decision about that. But the first chapter is fine. There's lots of things to read. I think it's a very readable book. It's the kind of book you go out there on the beach and read. For this is the kind of book that I read on the beach. The idea, of course, is that debt and law and violence and a variety of other things are all connected. And as he says, the problem is the moment one starts framing things in terms of debt, people will inevitably start asking who really owes what to whom. And it is a kind of permanent condition on the one hand, but I don't think that it should be normalized in that particular sense. I think that it sort of needs to be rethought in many ways. But raises some useful questions about, from an anarchist point of view or from a Marxian point of view. I think Graeber raises important points that just because it's there doesn't mean that it has to, it's permanent. So it has certain materialist elements to it, and I think that's what Graeber's analysis is doing. And the question he was raising is that there's all these versions of it, but in some ways these they don't have to be. It doesn't have to be the way it is, but he describes them, I think, in a certain kind of loving detail. By the same token, for the last 5,000 years, with a remarkable regularity, popular insurrections have begun the same way, with the ritual destruction of the debt records, tablets, papyri, ledgers, whatever form they might have taken in any particular time and place. After that, rebels usually go after the records of landholding and tax assessments, cancel the debts, and redistribute the land. That's kind of the cycle of it. On the one hand, you have to keep records, which is kind of a human thing. The difference, as I think Foucault talks about it, the difference between documents and monuments, that there's an inverted relationship, that in the pre-modern, you would have monuments, you build things. In the modern period, documents have their own monumentality, and that's, I think, the issue of debt. I think it's the same observation that Graeber is making in his first chapter. So he goes, there's a loving detail, I think, but I also think that it is. I think he remarks that we take it probably far too seriously, and that once it becomes institutionalized, it gains its own kind of problematic set of relations, and that there's probably some way of doing without it, because it does sort of feature a kind of conflict-driven set of relations among people. That is, it requires a certain type of thinking about property or about um, uh, not so much about money, but it is about property ultimately that debt is related. So it is that's why I think Graeber's worth reading. I just am not sure that we would read it in this particular context. It's the kind of book, as I said, um, I like thinking of it as light reading, and that, as I said, it's the kind of book that I would read on the beach. So I thought about thinking today of how I was going to begin, and one quote from Joan Robinson seemed to be important. The purpose of studying economics is not to acquire a set of ready-made answers to economic questions, but to learn how to avoid being deceived by economists. And there's certainly a cynical comment by Joan Robinson, but I think that Joan Robinson is really quite important. The other thing that I wanted to look at is a thing that I wrote a day or so ago, and I thought I would share it with you just simply because it covers things that we've been looking at. So I put something up on Saturday on Trump's reach and grasp. The Marxist professors are under your bed at the Villages, and you're number 6. This is an image from a get together of people who are fans of the British television program The Prisoner. And so there's cosplay, et cetera, and it includes, in fact, a big rover-like weather balloon. So the point I was trying to make, of course, is that it is kind of the prison house of language. And this was the result of Trump accusing Kamala Harris of being a Marxist, or at least that her father was a Marxist economics professor. Therefore, she must be a Marxist. And it's just this kind of simplistic idiocy that comes with Trump that I got sort of annoyed with. But it also allowed me to think a little bit about the history of the profession. So the critique, of course, of Biden and Kamala at all is that it's Marxist, or that's what Trump is claiming, and that it probably has as much to do with it as I pointed out as Trump's uncle. Trump likes to claim that because he had an uncle at MIT, that he must be as smart or as science savvy as he's smarter than he is, and he isn't, of course. And the idea is that in his recent speech in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, he essentially just yammered on about communists, and it was sort of pretty funny, but it was exactly the same structure of the smear done in 2008 of Bill Ayers and Barack Obama. Bill Ayers saw university professor in Chicago, but he was also married to Bernadine Dorn, a member of the Weather Underground, and Ayers himself was a member of the Weather Underground, but that was many, many years ago. And needless to say, not everyone in Weathermen was a full-out terrorist, although most were. So anyway, Trump makes these kinds of claims.
She'll be easier. She'll be easier than him. Her policies are so bad. Her policy. Remember, her father was a Marxist economic professor. He was a Marxist, an avowed Marxist. This is not what we want in this country.
And when you look at Donald Harris's work, he's not, well, he is a Marxist, let's just put it that way. But I think that in order to remain viable in the academy, I think he would refer to himself as a post-Keynesian or a neo-Ricardian. There's lots of ways of doing that to sort of get out of that little bind. But if you look at his list of publications, they are mainly questions that are raised in a Marxist way, or at least in a classical way. So did Donald Harris hold the post that was formerly held by Paul Buran? Needless to say, in an age of civil rights, Stanford likely paid Harris a normal faculty salary, which they did not pay to Paul A. Buran. The apocryphal story is that Buran's salary was frozen at an assistant professor level, even as he held a full professorship. It's sort of a joke, I suppose, that the central administration would have that, well, you believe in a classless society, et cetera, so we're not going to give you the salary you deserve at rank. Rather, we're going to hold it at the bare minimum. But that's an apocryphal story, and I've heard it in several places. I've also seen it in print. So, but if you can imagine that kind of the monkey business of academia, that does happen. Donald Harris was the first Black scholar granted tenure in the Stanford Department of Economics. Thomas Sowell, who was at the Hoover Institution, which is part of Stanford, and who's notoriously conservative or right wing, actually was actually a avowed Marxist when he was at the University of Chicago, and but he, like so many former whatever lefties who have become more conservative in their old age, that's probably another example of that. And it's sort of interesting. Sowell always can be counted on for an op-ed that asks certain weird libertarian questions. Anyway, and he's cranked out lots of books, but they don't have much detail on them, let's put it that way. Anyway, so I included that. I talked a little bit about, or I wrote a little bit about Paul Buran, that in Wikipedia, Paul A. Buran was promoted to full professor at Stanford University, and Buran was the only tenured Marxian economist in the United States until his death in 1964. It's just interesting to make that claim. Because the reality, of course, is that there are plenty of Marxists in the academy, but they're not going to cop to it in the middle of the Red Scare, et cetera. You could Schumpeter could have been seen as a Marxist, Minsky. They're just bunches of folks, and it just always amuses me that you can be a Marxist, you just can't admit it. And that's kind of a secret society or something that you certainly get a better paycheck if you don't admit it. Anyway, so it's a story, and I think that Buran was certainly committed to a variety of things. The other interesting thing, of course, is that there was another Paul Buran who's an engineer, and he was at Stanford at exactly the same time. So there's a Paul A. Buran and a Paul Buran at Stanford, and you shouldn't mix them up. They have very different points of view. Paul Buran, of course, the engineer, actually has something to do with the rise of Silicon Valley and electronic engineering, et cetera. Anyway, to finish up on the history of Donald Harris, father of Kamala. He really doesn't like becoming engaged with sort of the celebrity stuff. The fact of the matter, of course, is that the latter half of his career was spent after he decided to take early retirement. He actually spent time advising the economy of Jamaica, since he was from Jamaica. So that he actually did a lot of other things. I think he got knighted, actually, or say he got some kind of honor because of his work for the Jamaican government. Anyway, it is interesting that the Stanford Daily calls him a Marxist in 1976. Marxist scholar detractors felt he was too charismatic, a Pied Piper leading students astray from neoclassical economics. And so if you're going to survive in the academy, you can work in areas like development economics, economic history, economics of technology and macro, and you can still be a Marxist. You just can't sort of say that's what you do, even though everything that you do isn't. And so there are extensive articles. Actually, the British are much better at this. The Brits in The Economist actually wrote a rather good little article on his work. I mean, it's kind of a standard journalistic approach to it, but it does describe the fact that whatever that he may believe is certainly not the same thing that Kamala believes. And it closes by saying, for all his earlier radicalism, he has recommended fiscal discipline and crime reduction, as well as export-led growth and industrial strategy, as if Marxists don't have an opinion on this. In the end, however, perhaps his greatest economic legacy will be his daughter. So that's kind of where things wind up. And as you can see, a picture of Donald Harris. You know, I suppose when Kamala's born, I guess they're living in Berkeley. So whatever. Anyway, there's Kamala and Dad. Now, in the case of Trump, of course, Trump was arrested twice, 27 during a Ku Klux Klan riot, and in 1976 over code violations at a building he owned in Maryland. That being said, I've included two different articles, a part 1 and a part 2, that talk about the kind of foundational stuff for Piketty's work. And it covers kind of the things we've been looking at before, the tableau économique, the physiocrats kind of thinking about these matters. And it is the standard to look at it kind of in this way, that you would, and in fact, in volume 2 of Capital, it does resemble his first description, attempt to describe how circuits of capital operate in terms of the sphere of production and the sphere of consumption, Department 1 and Department 2. And that model is actually a reasonable little model. But anyway, there are two articles that I'll just read, and I hope that you'll get something out of it. In Thomas Piketty's doomsday model, slowing of growth in the 21st century will cause an inexorable increase in inequality. Piketty is not the first to propose a grand model of inequality and growth. To get some perspective on this model, let's see what the classical economists had to say. That's part 1, and how the neoclassical economists responded in part 2. So this is part 1. The first generation of classical economists, notably Francois Quesnay and Adam Smith in England, knew perfectly well where inequality came from. It's simply a fact of life that most land and other natural resources belong to a small hereditary nobility. In England, some 2% of the population owned most of the land. This nobility, or their ancestors, gained their estates by force, favoritism, or fraud. That is, conquest, gifts from the king, or bribes to magistrates. You know, when you read Graeber, that's essentially the whole story. It's the story of all of this kind of pillaging. The classical economists recognized that landowners, large and small, received unearned income for the mere fact of holding titles protected by the state. They called this unearned income rent. Besides the landowners, these economists identified two other social classes, capitalists who received profit by investing or interest by lending, and workers who received wages. Of course, they recognized that the classes overlapped. Successful capitalists soon bought land or married their daughters to landowners. And that's, the entire system of, debt, obligations, marriage, dowries, all that stuff is all part of this same system, as Graeber points out. Smith, witness to the English Industrial Revolution, proposed the first coherent theory of economic growth. At the start of his Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, he explains how production increases dramatically when workers cooperate and specialize. This can happen both within an enterprise. He gives an example of a pin factory, and through market exchange. The pin factory shows the kind of segmentation of processes, not unlike an assembly line. Hence, both increase in production, population density and improved trade, greater extent of the market, as Smith puts it, will generate economic growth. That's why Smith, like Kane, advocated free trade, both domestic and international. They opposed government-granted monopolies, such as exclusive trading privileges given to the British East India Company. This is why it's a kind of mercantilism. This is the pre-capitalist sort of mercantilism. They also advocated shifting taxes off of activities such as transport and sale of merchandise and onto rent by taxing land values, what Smith termed the most equitable of taxes. Smith observed that growth is already improving workers' living standards as well as undermining the elite landholders. So in his view, growth reduced inequality. The next generation of classical economists brought new and more dramatic perspectives to growth and inequality. Thomas Malthus claimed that workers' wages would forever remain at subsistence due to their alleged propensity to breed faster than food production could increase. And there's a certain, it's racial, it has other kinds of implications, of course. I mean, that's kind of the whole eugenics problem is kind of, it's Malthusian at its base in many ways. Any efforts to feed or otherwise assist the poor were actually counterproductive. The poor would just breed faster. By this logic, growth increased inequality because the bottom remained stuck. This view, while pleasing to the elite, would have horrified the humane Adam Smith. Now, David Ricardo, Malthus's contemporary and friend, proposed a marginal theory to explain the magnitude of land rent. The rent of a given parcel of land depends, he said, on its superiority to land barely worth using, that is, marginal land. Imagine you're a farm operator. How much more would you be willing to pay the owner of a fine, flat parcel down in the valley over a remote, steep parcel you could use for next to nothing? That extra payment is your rent. That is income to the landowner for the mere fact of holding legal title to land. Note that, of course, that location is usually the most important component of land quality. Ricardo's rent theory led him to propose a doomsday model even more frightening than Piketty's. As population grows, he said, the economy must expand onto lower and lower quality land. Since rent depends on the difference between the best and the poorest land in use, more and more of the economy's production will go to landowners as rent. It kind of builds on top of itself in that sense. Eventually, the landowners will take so much that there won't be enough to provide even starvation wages to workers or minimal profits to capitalists. Only improved technology and gains from trade can stave off collapse. Hence, Ricardo vigorously advocated free trade. This idea of free trade, of course, is not truly free. It just means a certain minimal or agreed constraints in terms of custom, that is, sort of taxes and fees charged to things exchanged between nations, et cetera, et cetera. In the final generation of classical economists, too, Karl Marx and Henry George, and we've heard of them before, attacked inequality with such force as to provoke a powerful backlash. Marx, a German revolutionary exile to England, rejected Malthus's wage theory. He focused on exploitation of workers by capitalists, among whom he now included landlords. However, like Ricardo, he predicted that growing inequality would lead eventually to a collapse of the capitalist system and its replacement by a new socialist society. In effect, Marx said growth increases inequality, leading to revolution, followed by equality. The classless society, et cetera, et cetera. Henry George's bestseller, Progress and Poverty, threw a searchlight on the inequities of the late 19th century. With Marx, Henry George rejected Malthus's wage theory. He added his own twist to Ricardo's theory of land rent. Just as marginal land determines rent, he said, that is, the poorest of the land determines how you're going to charge rent on the best of land. It also determines wages because a worker will not accept wages lower than what he could earn for himself on that marginalized land. But the greater the inequality of ownership of land and other natural resources, the lower will be the quality of marginal land, and hence the lower the wages. So there is some kind of correspondence between land and wage, but that it's a little abstract on the one hand for a party that doesn't do a lot of empirical work trying to work through whether that actually exists. George also added a twist to Adam Smith's theory of growth. Yes, growth results from cooperation and specialization, and the larger the population and the greater the extent of the market, the greater the potential for growth. But also, the more equal the people, the greater their ability to cooperate. In George's words, association inequality is the law of progress. So there's a certain kind of idealism that I think Henry George represents relative to a certain type of historical idealism that the 19th century provides. And in some ways, there's a certain kind of optimism about it, particularly in the American context. Hence, Henry George still being popular because of, and of course, attracted to some people because of a kind of reduction in the tax structure, which is attractive to libertarians. Marx saw history as progressing by action and reaction towards the inevitable overthrow of capitalism. By contrast, Henry George combined his modified growth theory with Ricardo's inequality theory to argue that progress carries the seeds of its own destruction. A fortunately situated, relatively egalitarian society may begin to grow and prosper, expanding and attracting population. However, this growth primarily benefits the holders of key parcels of land, such as parcels on the waterfront of port cities. You can see kind of how this, that because it's about location, you can see the gradation of quality of stuff. As the economy grows, so does inequality. Wages fall, relatively, if not absolutely. A wealthy, corrupt elite increasingly controls government. Eventually, the society collapses or becomes so weak as to fall to invaders, as, for example, did the Western Roman Empire. Now, this kind of argument becomes attractive to certain people. When you're talking about, sort of the fall of the Roman Empire, given it all. George feared this fate would soon befall the United States. Like his classical predecessors, he opposed government-granted monopolies, notably vast tracts of land handed to railroad companies like Southern Pacific. That's the whole business of the Transcontinental Railroad, et cetera, that it's not simply the right-of-ways for rail traffic, but it is also, of course, surrounding land, because you certainly need wood to make sleepers for the rails, for the roadbed, and et cetera, mines for the coal, for the locomotives, et cetera. Also, like his predecessors, Henry George proposed shifting taxes onto the unearned income of land and other natural resources. But unlike his predecessors, Henry George turned land taxation into a major and partially successful political crusade, not only in the United States, but in other countries, notably England and its colonies in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Hong Kong. Now, one of the reasons why this occurs, of course, is because you don't want to kind of overly bureaucratic, what Henry George gives us is a more streamlined sense of how you do taxation in that context. In practice, this meant increasing the land component of ordinary property taxes and removing the component on buildings and other improvements, a proposal easy to understand and implement back when property taxes were the primary taxes. Marx and Henry George and the huge political movements they inspired scared the pants off the elites of Europe and the United States. They had to be stopped, and not just physically. The classical focus on inequality and unearned income had to be disappeared from economics. As we will see in part 2, That was the purpose of neoclassical economics. So this is the more important one. Mason Gaffney, who was at University of California, Riverside, has shown how many individuals helped construct neoclassical economics, often with financial support from the robber barons and their successors. I will focus, this is an article by Polly Cleveland, cross-posted from the Popular Economics Press run by folks at the Union for Radical Political Economics, called Dollars and Cents. A very good reader for those who, it's not technical. People should read. He's going to focus on two, John Bates Clark, and in Europe, Wilfredo Pareto. Recall, Clark is important because I think the Clark Medal, as I recall, is given to economists below the age of 40. It's kind of like an early career. It's like the mathematics field medal, where young scholars are given this to show that they've really done interesting stuff in the first part of their career. Recall from part one that the classical economists divided society into three classes. Owners of land and other natural resources received unearned income or rent from their holdings, often derived from conquest or inheritance. Capitalists, who often overlapped with landowners, owned physical capital like factories or ships and received interest or profit from investing. Workers received wages. Also recall that the classical economists favored taxing rent by taxing land value specifically. And Henry George crusaded for this type of tax. John Bates Clark of Columbia, for whom is named the prestigious John Bates Clark Medal, transformed economics into an inequality-free abstraction. Writing in the 1890s, Clark merged land into physical capital, thus obliterating the classical understanding of land. It just wanted to simplify factors of production. Well, that's just a simple way to do it because it makes the math work better. It's a lot actually harder to accommodate the physicality, the physical materiality of land. Better to consider land equal to capital in that particular sense. In other words, the factors are seen as land, labor, and capital. And then if you collapse them to get only two of them, rather, capital and labor, it just makes the math easier. In the new neoclassical world, capital, including land, originates solely from productive investment. There is no unearned rent, only legitimate profit. So, in other words, you collapse rent into profit. Ironically, Marx merged rent into profit because he considered both illegitimate. So there's different reasons for making the math simpler in that particular context. Knowing, of course, that, there are just people like David Harvey or whatever who have decided to, well, no, it's about, we have to break out capital into, land stuff, space and time and all that stuff. That makes the Marxian stuff actually more interesting. Clark reduced economics to only two factors of production, capital and labor. In Clark's model, supply and demand in a free market ensure that capital and labor each earns its marginal product. That is the contribution of the final amount supplied. This outcome is supposedly both fair and efficient. Clark writes, the share of wealth that falls to any producing agent tends, under natural law, to equal the amount that he creates. A man's pay tends to equal the value of the product or fraction of the product that can be specifically imputed to him. So much for any claim that laborers are exploited. Clark also eliminated time, which is even more weird, giving us the familiar timeless, spaceless, contextless world of economics. But without time, there can be no history. And without history, no questioning the justice of property ownership or the legitimacy of institutions. So right off the get-go, we're looking that, you don't have to think about or worry about kind of ethical questions of justice, etc. There's a certain neutrality that all of this represents. And there's no, that adjudication is just a messy thing that you add on the end. Neoclassical economics in the United States followed Clark to the extent that the future Clark Medal and a Swedish Bank Nobel Prize winner, Robert Solow, could joke in 1955 that if God had meant there to be more than two factors of production, he would have made it easier for us to draw three-dimensional diagrams. Yuck, yuck, yuck. Meanwhile, over in Europe, Italian nobleman Vilfredo Pareto made two key contributions to the emerging neoclassical paradigm. First, he estimated that 80% of the land in Italy belonged to 20% of the population, from which he concluded that inequality follows a natural law, that is, the 80-20 rule, with which we shouldn't tamper. More famously, he developed the policy rule known as Pareto improvement. Pareto improvement holds that we should undertake no policy changes unless they make at least one person better off and no one worse off. This is this whole business about that becomes the arguments about indifference curves and a bunch of other crazy stuff that is mainly mathematical and goes to a certain kind of Marshallian math stuff. But, you know, reality doesn't quite work that way. Sounds fair and reasonable, doesn't it? By that logic, we should have paid the slaveholders in full after the Civil War. There should have been reparations. By that logic, once having cut taxes on the rich, we cannot raise them again. That's kind of in the background of these sort of tax cut things that the right wing loves doing. The status quo rules, no matter how cruel or illogical the route that got us there. Under the new neoclassical regime, mathematical models proliferated like kudzu vines in the South, their very complexity keeping them safely obscure. Few are more famous among economists than Robert Solow, the same guy, 1956 simple two-factor growth model, assuming a world of uniform depreciating physical capital, implicitly ignoring durable natural resources like land and uniform quality labor. Solow's model predicts that economies will grow towards a steady state where depreciation just equals new investment. You know, the market's clear, whatever, it all works out. And because the richer you are, the slower you grow, poorer economies and poorer people within economies will catch up. Solow's model is cute as a button, but its extreme abstractness lies poles apart from Smith's original common sense model, explaining growth, economic growth, in terms of cooperation and specialization. Almost 60 years later, Thomas Piketty has taken Solow's model, growth model, and added his own twist. In Solow's model, the poor catch up to the rich. In Piketty's model, the modern decline in growth does not affect investment. And this is what Piketty's point is, that because of the long waves or sort of long run measurements, the divergence, there is a divergence, but it shouldn't be. Consequently, now that return to capital investment exceeds the rate of growth, then inequality must inexorably increase. So it's always tied to it. This model, he says, determines the fate of the 21st century. And this is just simply the empirical modeling. What he does is he says, well, you know, there's these historical rates, and they sort of did this in, various models in terms of Europe and in some cases America. And, you know, you can't it's really empirical. It's hard to refute. Critics have torn into Piketty's model, including some like Jamie Galbraith, who still give Piketty kudos for stirring up debate. In my view, Piketty's and Solow's models are both fundamentally flawed in that they rest on the same ahistorical, apolitical, two-factor neoclassical foundation. Yes and no. Actually, the Piketty is more than a two-factor neoclassical foundation, but that's just my interpretation of it. But anyway, as the classical economists understood inequality derives from power, ultimately the power of conquerors to exact tribute from the conquered. It's just like Graeber's book. And as the progressives, the New Dealers, and the civil rights activists have demonstrated, democratic societies can counter that power with well-designed tax and regulatory policies supported by an aroused public. We are not prisoners of a mathematical model. So that's my little reading today. I hope you got something out of it. Are there queries or questions?
Sorry, I can't think of a question at the moment.
People can always ask questions later, and I'll attempt to answer them in the Discord. The point is that we've had several kind of dominant or alternative streams of thought in economics. They all have the same. They're all they spring from the same foundations. It's just that it's a certain moment they either got abstracted in a bad way, in the sense that it was no longer about people, that's the kind of difference that occurs. It just gets abstracted, so it bears little relationship to reality. But it's also easier to solve because the math is simpler, and it's that kind of elegance, I suppose, that people like in mathematical models that have tended to privilege the mathematical turn in economics, knowing full well, of course, that some of these numbers, it's garbage in, garbage out, and there's a lot more unevenness in the entire business. And often you have to make certain kind of generalizations that inductive sort of determinations that aren't quite accurate, and in fact get lots of people into trouble. You could say that many of our foibles with, as we were looking at in terms of the 2008 crisis, are because, at one level, we just didn't have that much control over all the elements of what's going on. The regulatory ball got dropped or whatever. That there needed to be greater regulatory control over the decision to put out, unbacked, securitization of various loans, and et cetera, and hence creating this huge liquidity problem that caused the crisis.
I didn't have a question, but I had a comment when you mentioned wages and time. Thought of punching the clock. And today on our trip into the small town that we're near, there's an old flour factory or mill, grind fresh grain.
Uh-huh.
And there was a punch clock in there all the way from Cincinnati, Ohio, Cincinnati timepieces from the turn of last century. And it struck me how expensive that must have been for that technology in such a tiny establishment all the way in the middle of nowhere, Norway at that time. At what time does a company choose to spend their money on that tech to maintain the control over the worker to ensure they're not
it's a standardized clock, so that's probably the reason. You would want, it's a black box in that sense.
Yeah. It just seemed like such a small establishment.
Yeah.
Such a
Well, the whole idea of time clocks, I mean, that's just a feature of capitalism.
I posted some pictures in the chat, everyone.
That's a pretty fancy little time clock too.
Mm.
I mean, look at that sucker. Anyone else? Okay.
Well, I think this is very interesting, and so I hope you continue with it. I think it's, clear and understandable and important stuff.
Well, what I think I'm going to do is pick these little sort of more fragmentary or short articles that have a concise point and that just reinforce certain ideas. It's kind of what I've been doing with these big articles or the books that are too technical, is to try and, separate out, like I did with the Japanese, the book on Japanese Marxian economy, is to try and not put all the math in, but try and get basic ideas out there. And
Yeah,
I will try and do that, partially for my own purposes, but just simply to make it easy for people listening to whatever this recorded stuff I'm going to do. The people can sort of get something out of it. So yes, so I'm going to try and do it that way. Otherwise, if we were plodding through 500 plus pages of Graeber, we just get lost. I mean, it's a good story. I just, I think people would get tired at some moment. That doesn't mean to say that it shouldn't be read. I think it reads very quickly, in fact. And as I said, summer reading, but my kind of summer reading. But
How many afternoons at the beach?
it
Two? No,
reads
actually, I
actually.
tried to say something earlier. You said time clocks, a feature of capitalism. I think of time clocks as the primary tool of capital.
Oh, indeed. Indeed. I mean, it is why in various industries, workers were given pocket watches. I mean, it was sort of a nice little thing to give to someone, but also the pocket watch forced you to think about time, right?
Yeah.
You weren't
Oh, and
being.
it's weird. I have a conflicted thing. I mean, I actually love watches, but
I like watches too, but whatever. Anyway. Okay, so let me do the little sign off here. Let me thank you for your attention. Note that I put up the links to this in our Discord. We do have readings on file. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to put up tomorrow, but it'll probably be some simplification of one element of Capital Volume 2, and I'll try not to make it too complicated. That's, I think, what I'm going to do. There's a couple of other things I've already done that we'll work on. So thank you very much. And Joe, you can shut down the live stream.